Okay. All right. Adding to our presentations for this afternoon, we have joining us from the Department of Justice, framing the conversation, UNDRIP as a framework for change in urban, for urban Indigenous people. So online, we have a presentation. Welcome to Michelle Keller and Gabrielle Heroux. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you good now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today to present. My name is Gabrielle Heroux, as you just heard, and I am here from the Department of Justice within the UN Declaration Act Implementation Secretariat, where I work on the consultation and cooperation team as a senior analyst. And I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle Keller, who can introduce herself as well, perhaps.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Gabrielle. My name is Michelle Keller. I'm an acting senior analyst on the same team as Gabrielle, and I'm actually based here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but reporting to Ottawa.
So our plan for our presentation today, we will give this PowerPoint here with some information about the work that we're doing on the UN Declaration Act and the associated action plan, and also hopefully leave as much time as possible for some questions and some discussion as well. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I do want to start off today with a brief overview of the UN Declaration on with a brief overview of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which for short I refer to as the Declaration or just the UN Declaration, and is also called UNDRIP. It really is at the heart of the work that we are doing on the UN Declaration Act and the action plan. And so even though this may not be new information for everyone that's here, I think it's an important reminder of how we got to where we are, and it really is the center of the work that we do and the driving force of the work that we do. So the UN Declaration was adopted at the UN in 2007 after decades of work by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leaders from around the world, including here from coast to coast to coast on this land. The declaration contains a preamble as well as 46 articles that affirm both the individual and the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And together, they set out the minimum standards for the survival, the dignity, and the well-being of Indigenous peoples throughout the world. And so I just want to stress that part again about the minimum standards. So the rights in the declaration aren't the maximum, they're not the ceiling of what we should aspire to. They really are the floor on which we should then build. And it's important also to reiterate that the declaration doesn't create new rights. It didn't give rights to Indigenous peoples. It affirms existing rights, rights that already existed and that are inherent. And those rights that are in the declaration aren't separate and independent from each other. They speak to each other. They are interrelated. They are interdependent, indivisible, and universal. And they touch on all of the themes that you can see on this slide here. So everything from civil and political rights to economic and social rights to the right to participate in decision-making, rights related to language and education and lands and the environment, all of that and more is contained in the UN Declaration. And it also outlines the state's obligations, in this case, Canada's obligations, when it comes to ensuring those rights and how to do that. If we could go to the next slide, please. So Canada endorsed the UN Declaration without qualification in 2016 and made a commitment at that time to fully and effectively implement the Declaration and the rights that it affirms. That led to the development of the UN Declaration Act, which was the law through which the government intends to fulfill that commitment. So that law received royal assent and came into force just over 2.5 years ago on June 21st, 2021. And it contains 3 main commitments and obligations on the part of the government, all of which have to be carried out in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. So just very briefly, there's some information about those 3 commitments and obligations on this slide here. Section 5 of the Act has to do with making sure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration. Section 7 has to do with our obligation to report annually on progress. And then Section 6, which will be the main sort of focus of our presentation today, is about the action plan. There was an obligation to develop an action plan on how to implement the Declaration within 2 years from royal assent. And so that's what we'll be mostly focusing on. Next slide, please. So to develop that action plan, the Department of Justice started a broad consultation and cooperation process with Indigenous peoples in December of 2021, so just over 2 years ago. The first phase of that process, which is the process is outlined here on this slide here, the first phase of that led to the release of a draft version of the action plan in March of 2023, which then led into an intensive second phase of consultation and cooperation to revise that draft, finalize the action plan, and the action plan was launched publicly in June of 2023. So just 7 months ago or so. And throughout both phases of that entire consultation and cooperation process, the Department of Justice held hundreds of meetings with Indigenous peoples. We received over 100 written submissions. We held information sessions, so bilateral meetings, multilateral information sessions, regional roundtables, and like I said, received all of those written submissions as well that we all compiled. And next slide, please. So all of that feedback that we received throughout that process, all of those priorities, those recommendations that were brought forward by Indigenous peoples, came together to create the action plan from all of that input. The action plan itself is a wide-ranging, whole-of-government and evergreen roadmap to advance the objectives of the UN Declaration. So I'll touch on that evergreen aspect a little bit later. But when I say wide-ranging, what I mean by that is that it contains 181 measures, which are divided into 5 chapters and which touch on all of the themes that I talked about earlier. And those chapters are listed there on the slide, as well as some more information about the action plan. And for the whole of government component, the action plan identifies, when you read it, you'll see that each action plan measure identifies the government department and or agency that is responsible for each measure. And in total, there are 28 of them named in the plan. So that means that there are 28 government departments and agencies with a direct role in implementing the action plan. This isn't just something that the Department of Justice is doing. This is work that will require effort from the entire federal government. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual representation of some of the information that is in the action plan of the different action plan measures and sort of how they break down into different categories. The graph on the left shows the breakdown of measures along the different themes. So you can see there, the biggest bars are self-determination, self-government and recognition of treaties, economic and social and health rights, and civil and political rights. So those are the themes that have the most associated action plan measures. The graph on the right shows how many measures each department is responsible for. As you can see, and is perhaps not a surprise, Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services Canada are the leads on more measures than the other departments. And then the graph in the middle shows how many measures are in each of the 5 chapters of the action plan. The biggest chapter by far is the shared priorities chapter, and I will get into that a little bit more on the next slide. We can go to the next slide, please. So the shared priorities chapter contains 111 of the 181 action plan measures, so the majority, and it does a couple of things. So it contains measures that address the requirements under the UN Declaration Act. So the law, the UN Declaration Act, requires that the action plan has to include 4 different kinds of measures. So it has to include measures to ensure the consistency of laws with the declaration. It has to include measures to address injustice, prejudice, violence, and systemic racism and discrimination. The action plan has to include measures to promote mutual respect, understanding, and good relations, including through human rights education. And it has to include measures to ensure oversight and accountability on the implementation of the UN Declaration. So those measures that meet those requirements of the law are in the shared priorities chapter. This chapter also, the second sort of aspect of it, is that it addresses cross-cutting priorities that were put forward by Indigenous partners, including First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Indigenous women, elders, youth, persons with disabilities, 2S LGBTQI+ people, and urban and off-reserve organizations. And there are some examples of those measures on this slide that are contained in the shared priorities chapter. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So there are also measures in the shared priorities chapter that specifically address priorities put forward by urban and off-reserve Indigenous organizations. And again, there are some examples here. They include continuing to support friendship centers and the important work that they do, as well as other urban Indigenous coalitions, implementing an urban, rural, and northern housing strategy, taking steps to implement the Cap-Daniels decision and addressing gaps with regard to the Cap-Daniels decision and that it has not yet been implemented, as well as supporting access to post-secondary education, skills training, and employment in a way that is inclusive of Indigenous peoples, regardless of where they reside. So these are just a few examples. The measures in the shared priorities chapter are meant to be broad and inclusive. And they should be understood that way, and they should also be implemented that way. So not in a way that excludes anyone or is, focused on any one, particular group, but they are shared priorities and they're meant to be understood in a broad and inclusive way. And I will turn it over to my colleague Michelle for the next few slides.
Thanks, Gabrielle. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So as Gabrielle mentioned, the UN Declaration Act Action Plan was launched in June of 2023, and this milestone marks this next phase of collaborative work with Indigenous peoples, this implementation phase. And as stipulated in Section 6 of the Act, the action plan must not only be prepared, but also implemented in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. And of note, about 25% of the measures specifically commit to implementation through co-development with Indigenous peoples. And so in the short term, the federal government is working with Indigenous partners, so all those that we've been meeting with, to prioritize action plan measures and to develop implementation plans, timelines, and metrics. So we are still in the earlier phases, for sure, of implementation. And to support Indigenous people's participation in this work, to recognize their time and expertise, Budget 2022 provided $37 million in funding over 5 years, as well as $4 million ongoing to support Indigenous governments, organizations, groups to continue contributing meaningfully to implementation of the Act. And more concretely, Justice Canada launched a new funding program called the Indigenous Partnership Fund, and a recent call for proposals as well, which closed at the end of January. And so the Secretariat is currently reviewing applications, some of which were also received from urban and off-reserve groups, with all ministerially approved agreements expected to be in place for 24-25 for that fiscal year as soon as possible. If we could move to the next slide, please. So Section 7 of the UN Declaration Act requires the federal government to report annually to Parliament on progress made on Section 5 and 6. So Section 5 being the consistency of laws of Canada, as Gabrielle mentioned, and on Section 6 being the development and implementation of the action plan. So the first annual report was tabled in Parliament in June of 2022, followed by the second in July of 2023. And we consulted with an increasingly larger number of Indigenous partners, and this list of partners is available in the annual report published online. And work is now underway to prepare the third annual report, expected to be tabled in June of 2024. And this year we would like to reach a much larger number of Indigenous partners because their perspectives on the development of the action plan and the early phases of implementation will really be critical to inform the report and how we continue to work together. I also want to emphasize that the action plan is an evergreen document, and Gabrielle mentioned this earlier in her presentation as well. So it must be reviewed, amended, as per Section 6 of the UNDA, and Action Plan Measure 21 also commits Justice Canada to co-developing and implementing a process to review and update the action plan every 5 years, as well as a process to make amendments to the action plan itself. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this slide just provides highlights a number of resources available on the Justice Canada website. There is, of course, the UN Declaration itself with some explanations around it, information about the Act. The action plan is available online, accompanied by a What We Learned to Date report. The 2 first annual reports are also published there, as well as a number of other resources, including a panel discussion that took place a few months ago between a number of Indigenous partners that were invited to provide their perspectives on implementation. And if we could just move to the next slide, I'll just say that this concludes our presentation, and Gabrielle and I would be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you may have so that we can have a good discussion. Thank you. Merci.
Would we be able to have a copy of that presentation? Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
We can hear you, but there is an echo. Quite an echo.
For over 40 years, I've worked with Indigenous people in the area of health care services. Here in Canada, we have actually 300 times the tuberculosis.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I might have to, just so that you're not, you know, sort of going too far there. We can't really make out what you're saying.
The World Health Organization has identified that tuberculosis is a main indicator of any country's overall well-being. My question is, I have not heard you mention the Department of Health is one of the departments that is included in those consultations or in addressing some of the areas, and also would be interested to know whether there's anything in the action plan, because like when we really under what the coalitions are all about, we are really one of our main roles is to provide better services to Indigenous people, Indigenous people in particular. And when we really think about it, that we have not only one of the highest tuberculosis rates in the world, which is an indicator for other health services, and we also have now an alarming increase in addictions, etc. Are there any provisions in the action plan to address those matters? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We might have missed part of it. There were some audio challenges where it was a little bit difficult to make out what you were saying. So I think I might have missed the beginning part, but if I understand correctly, your question was about whether there were measures in the action plan around mental health and addictions, and there are. And I believe it is for there's again an echo. I hope people are able to hear me okay. Yes, so Action Plan Measure 81 in the Shared Priorities chapter is specifically has to do with culturally appropriate health and wellness services and support for holistic approaches to healing, including community-based, land-based, culturally relevant, and trauma-informed mental health services, addressing, among other things, suicide and addiction crises. And that of course, the lead for that action plan measure would be Indigenous Services Canada. And it is in there in the Shared Priorities chapter. That is something that we, heard loud and clear from partners that needed to be included, that had to be a commitment in the action plan that the federal government would now be committed to and accountable to, and would have to work in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous partners on. So that is in there, and I hope that answers your question. I don't know if I missed another part of it because of the audio issues, but
Thank you very much. This answered. Thank you very much. This answered just one part of my question. I'm also really interested to know whether any items regarding the physical health are part of the action plan as well. Thank you. Which addresses infectious diseases as one of the areas. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So yes, there are also action plan measures related to health, access to health services and health care, ensuring that it is available and accessible and culturally relevant, and delivered where possible through Indigenous institutions, addressing racism in healthcare services, which we know is a huge problem, and infectious diseases. I don't know if that is mentioned specifically in any one of the measures. I would have to check back through those measures to see if that is specifically mentioned, but there certainly are measures pertaining to healthcare, physical health, and and mental health, of course, as we already discussed, but certainly yes, those are in there.
In BC, we're non-treaty, so we're still fighting for self-governance and land sovereignty. And so what about the commitment for the RCMP federally on the treatment of Indigenous people who are trying to reclaim and have access to their traditional territories? Because we've seen time and time again where RCMP are arresting our elders or mistreating of our people, and that's concerning. And clearly there's an there's a lot of Indigenous people within the criminal justice system as well. So when we think of the overrepresentation and the racism within these institutions in the criminal justice system, what does that look like in the commitment with UNDRIP in land protectors, you know, and MMIWG?
Thank you. That's a great question, and of course, very important issues as well. There are commitments in the action plan around the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system, and work that needs to be done urgently to address that. And there are several commitments with sort of bullets as well that are in there about the different sort of approaches that need to be taken and the different sort of steps that need to be undertaken at the federal level in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples around reforms to the criminal justice system and the implementation of an Indigenous justice strategy. There are also commitments around gender-based violence and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and addressing that crisis as well. So there are commitments in the action plan in relation to that too. With regard specifically to the RCMP, there is a commitment in there around more training and education, and I know that can be a really fraught, sort of thing as well, but specifically geared towards the RCMP. And I know, so that is one aspect of that is specifically named in the action plan. And then of course, there are the broader sort of measures related to reforming the criminal justice system and revitalizing Indigenous laws and legal traditions and approaches to justice that will have an impact also on the RCMP and on policing more generally. So those aspects are touched on in the action plan, because it's true, those issues that you point out are very important crises that need to be addressed urgently.
I have a question, actually. So traditionally, when, despite our best efforts to be able to have our rights met previously, we have had to rely upon the Human Rights Commission or the Human Rights Code. However, despite our best efforts to be able to address things like racism, there continues to be no consequence, even though we do face racism and discrimination very badly in our organizations, but yet there still is no consequence, or there still is no organization to be able to assist when organizations are infringing upon our rights. So is there any consideration for that in the action plan?
Thank you. That's a great question. And one of the requirements in the UN Declaration Act was that there had to be measures in the action plan to address systemic racism and systemic discrimination. That was a requirement under the law. It was written into that, and those commitments had to be in the action plan. And so there are measures around that. There is a section in the action plan in the shared priorities chapter outlining those measures. And one of those has to do with an Indigenous human rights monitoring mechanism. And so that is action plan measure number 19 in the shared priorities chapter. And it has to do with the development of a mechanism specifically for Indigenous human rights. So what that would look like, what form that could take, what the specific responsibilities of that mechanism would be, all of that has to be determined in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous people, so that work is still at a very preliminary phase. And whether that would, look like the Canadian Human Rights Commission, or whether there's a different type of, body or that might work better, all of that has to be determined with Indigenous peoples. And so that's still very early days, but that idea of having that mechanism in there is a commitment now in the action plan. Because as you say, right, like the existing mechanisms clearly haven't been sufficient, and so there needs to be something more.
Mari Lamyan, in Susan Pinyan. Chaltumeyu, for your presentation. Thank you so much. I guess I have kind of a follow-up question. To my understanding, the UNDRIP is not legally binding at the moment. That's why we don't have consequences, right, for whenever we experience cases of oppression where the articles of the UNDRIP are trespassed by organizations. Is there any indication that there could be a moment where it will be legally binding?
Thanks for that question. That's also a big question for sure. It's true that as a declaration, a UN declaration, those types of instruments are not legally binding in the same way that like a UN, convention would be, where, like the Convention on Civil and Political Rights or on Economic and Social Rights, right? Like those are binding in a way that declarations are not. So there is that aspect. But that said, having now brought the UN Declaration Act into force, the commitments in the act are now law in Canada. And so that act commits Canada to implementing the declaration in Canada. And the action plan measures in the action plan are commitments now on the part of the federal government that we do have to now report on. And that includes having to bring the laws of Canada to be in line with the declaration. That is a commitment in law now. Following through on the measures in the action plan is now a commitment in law, an obligation under the law. Reporting annually on progress is an obligation now under the law. And so, and the courts have also been clear that even though, and all the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court have been clear that even though, the UN Declaration isn't a binding instrument in the way that other conventions might be, it does have application in Canada, and it can and should be used to interpret, Canadian law and legal decisions and make decisions in Canada. So I think, while there isn't that same sort of binding in the way that a convention is binding, it still very much has force and impact in Canada, and the commitments and the obligations in the UN Declaration Act are definitely binding.
Hi. Hello? Sorry. My question for you kind of goes back to your, you talked about co-development and in consultation with Indigenous people several times. But what I'm seeing, and I just want you to kind of talk on this and sort of tell us where you guys are going with this. But I heard you also say you've held hundreds of meetings, and you had all these submissions. I know we did a submission as well. But my question to you is, UNDRIP is for all Indigenous people, and Bill C-15 is for all Indigenous people in Canada. But there are more than 600 First Nations in Canada, and a lot of your action plan talks about co-development and in consultation with Indigenous partners. Well, my feeling is if UNDRIP is for all Indigenous people, we should all have a voice. And I understand that, we have to organize and funnel our voice. But, for me, I'm from the Blood Tribe, and nobody speaks for the Blood Tribe but the Blood Tribe. So my question to you is, what's Canada's plan? And you also said we hope to have more partners, coming on board, which is great. My question to you is, what's Canada's plan to hear from all 600 First Nations and these very relevant urban organizations that represent huge populations of our people that reside off reserve? What is the plan to hear from everybody? Because one of our values is we don't leave anybody behind. And when some of us have a voice, it's not good. Everybody needs to have a voice. And there are over 600 First Nations in Canada, and there are many urban organizations that represent our people. And I see only a small portion of people involved in this co-development and engage or being part of the consultation process, not everybody. So what is the plan to hear from everybody? Because if we're really going to be effective, then we need to hear from everybody. And there are hundreds of federal laws that now need to be harmonized. What's the strategy to get people's input on all of that? How are you going to prioritize which ones are most important and will have the most benefit immediately, and so on and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you for that. That really gets to the heart of the, the work that we need to do going forward. As far as how we are going to, prioritize it, like there are, as you say, so many laws that need to be brought, into alignment and made consistent with the declaration. And the work of prioritizing those laws, the work of prioritizing the work of action plan measures. I'm getting an echo again. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. It's echoing online, so I don't know if that's the same in the room, but all of that, that does need to be done in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. And so even just sort of developing the strategy as to how that prioritization is going to take place, that's not something that we can do on our own, right? These strategies have to be done with Indigenous peoples. We have to do that prioritization work with Indigenous peoples. And that is the work of the Department of Justice, but also of all of the 28 government departments that are responsible for their action plan measures, and all of the departments that have laws that need to be, brought into consistency with the UN Declaration. So, and as far as ensuring that we reach and are working with as many Indigenous peoples as possible, I couldn't agree more. That is essential to the work that we need to do, because you are absolutely right that the UN Declaration is for all Indigenous peoples. It isn't for the national Indigenous organizations. It isn't for the other representative bodies. It's for Indigenous peoples who have individual and collective rights, and are the rights holders. And so we have made and continue to make as many efforts as we can to reach Indigenous peoples and sort of work beyond the national Indigenous organizations. And though we do work through the permanent bilateral mechanisms, we do work with the AFN, with ITK, with the MNC, but we very consciously have tried to expand beyond that, to work regionally, to work locally, to work with organizations that represent Indigenous women, Indigenous youth, again, at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level. And we have been working with organizations representing urban and off-reserve Indigenous peoples and in those areas as well. Again, at the national level, with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, at the regional level with Friendship Center associations, and at the local level with individual organizations as well. Because it is really important to have all of those voices reflected and to have all of those perspectives reflected. And that's something that we did during the consultation and cooperation process to develop the action plan, and that we will continue to do going forward as we go into implementation. And of course, the Department of Justice, we're one department of all of the ones that have to be involved in the implementation. I don't want to speak on behalf of all of the other government departments, but I know that the action plan commits us to consultation and cooperation, and commits us in some places to development. And that means, working with Indigenous peoples. There's no other way around it. So we do have to do that. And your point is something that we always have sort of at the front of our mind, is how do we get to the rights holders, and how do we get those perspectives?
I'm Dawn Robbins. I'm Cree. I'm from James Smith, Tri-Nation of 3 bands, and I'm but we look at our justice system, and I think anybody in this crowd will know that I lost lots of relatives last year in September, and our justice system has failed us. We need to keep communicating. We need to have more for our Indigenous people. We need to have more programs. I sat on the NAACJ when they were starting the release starts at intake, supposed to be rolling out in 2020. Unfortunately, COVID happened, but COVID didn't negate the responsibility of the staff, which I have 3 children that are also guards, that do the best interest of our children. I also am a signature to the SIM project, the community intervention model, which deals with gangs. But not once have I been, except for Minister Tell, having a conversation when the announcement came that, did you come to my community and talk to the frontline people that work in these areas? And it's really frustrating to know that millions of dollars behind NAACJ, behind the SIM project that rolled out in different areas, that have gone out there, that have been, there's all these consultations, but who did you really talk to? Because if you're talking to FSIN, AFN, all those other places, they look after our nations. They don't look after our urban areas. And we are sitting in the city of jails in Prince Albert. We have the penitentiary, we have the women's jail, we also have our correctional system, we also have the youth, right? And now we're expanding on that. We have homes for our youth, right? So who are you talking to in these consultations that knows the best interest of our people in our communities? Because it's really frustrating when you live in and breathe in these areas and nothing's being done for our people. Not the proper programming, not the proper consultation. And you know what? We're consultation out. We need action. And that's a huge problem. I wouldn't have lost so many members in my community last year in September if communication programs and those things were put into place. Now our nation, our own nation, whether it's a Tri-Nation or James Smith as a cover nation, are going to set to heal for generations to come. But where do we go from here? Are we going to talk about our own policing? Are we going to talk about our own justice system? Are we going to talk about taking care of our own people? Because whenever you do something, it's not for us without us. And until now, those words have not been spoken. We've been told what to do. We've been told how to do it. But nothing ever comes back to take us back to our heritage, who we are as grassroots people. I said, we're smart people. We're resilient people. We're loving people. And if we can combat that, then we can start progress in going the right direction. And unfortunately, I'm going to say it right now, we are an industry. Regardless if it's the prison system, why fix the prison system, right? Because my whole town, half my town are going to be out of jobs. We're an industry in the health system. We're an industry in the education system. We can't even put our own documents and our own truths without it having to be verified or validated by institution, a white institution. My mom was the director of education in Saskatchewan for 42 years. She's a grandmother of education who erected the First Nations University of Canada. I lost my childhood to politics. My dad kicked the doors open to, Parliament years back, and they've been trying to take them down right to this day. They try to take my father down. He kicked the doors open to Parliament for our people to stand up tall and straight. And they have the answers. We just need the government to meet us there. And you know what? He wrote the how. The how is always missing, and we need to get there. And until we do that in any sector that we work with, whether it's justice, whether it's working with UNDRIP, putting UNDRIP in all these areas, we're never going to get there until we learn the how. And I don't know if you have an answer. I just wanted to put it out there that we need more consultation for the frontline people in the areas that
are very valuable because we're not just talking about justice. We're talking about gangs, guns, and drugs. We're talking about gangs specifically and everything that goes within the criminal activity. We're suffering in our areas, and we're suffering in our nation, and it's going to take a long time for my nation to heal.
Thank you so much.
Priscilla,
Like one final question and then provide some information, invite you to supper.
Thank you. Norm Leach, Scotty Chat, please let So recognizing, of course, that Canada was one of the holdout nations and was probably the last to adopt UNDRIP out of 190 nations or whatever in the UN. And that in drafting the framework, that it has to limit its obligations and the costs associated to adopting UNDRIP. And that was why it was a holdout, because it didn't want to have all these unlimited obligations to Indigenous people that I guess in its mind it couldn't afford. But it also, so the framework must reflect that. And the framework is how Canada purports to implement UNDRIP. So the UNDRIP is on its own, but then Canada is responsible for creating the framework for implementing it in Canada, which is kind of an entirely different thing. And it is the limiting factor to the application of UNDRIP, even though Canada will say it's legally binding and that it's committed to abiding by UNDRIP. The framework does limit it, and it does so through the distinctions-based approach. So the question is, so how many urban Indigenous people helped write the framework? And it's probably not very many. And then how much of the framework was written in an Indigenous language? And I expect none of it. And how much of the framework reflects an Indigenous definition of justice? And probably none of it, because of course it's rooted in the colonial justice system and the colonial system of written laws, which go all the way back to, I don't know, the Magna Carta and even the Bible and all the roots of the Canadian urban justice system. And that the inequities built into the Canadian system, that the UNDRIP is designed to mitigate and to remedy, and all those injustices and inequities that are supposed to be fixed by UNDRIP and the framework are rooted in the alienation of Indigenous lands and colonization. And that's the root cause of all of these injustices that are supposed to be remedied here. So when will Canada begin the discussion of increasing the amount of land that Indigenous people have in this country beyond 0.3%? Indigenous peoples are gifted, apparently by Canada, 0.3% of the land in Canada is allocated to Indigenous people. And that is the root of all these problems. There wouldn't have to be an UNDRIP if we got half our land back. So how does Canada justify limiting the land set aside for Indigenous people to less than 1/3 of 1%? Canada is the second largest country in the world. It has an absolutely relatively tiny population of 40 million people in that giant landmass, and it has to somehow, can it justify limiting the amount of land for Indigenous people to 0.3%? If we got half of it back, we wouldn't need these conversations. We would have everything we needed. So when does that conversation start?
thank you for that question, and I don't know that I will have an answer for you on when that conversation will start, or when the government of Canada, would come to that conversation. I think that's I think there's no way around acknowledging the truth of what you said. You know, but again, I think that that's a question that I myself may not be able to answer. You know, I think to some of your other questions as well about the development of the action plan and how that came to be, and to the extent to which Indigenous peoples living in urban areas contributed to the action plan. We do have, and if you want to refer to it, there is an annex that is available about the partners that did contribute to the action plan and provided submissions. They did include urban Indigenous organizations, and we continue to work with those organizations at a national and regional and local level, because again, you know, there's no ignoring the fact that the majority of Indigenous peoples reside in urban areas, and that's a reality that we have to work with, that we, you know, can't escape. The question of Indigenous languages is a really important and very good one, and something that we are that is a topic for us as well too, that we are thinking about. And how do we you know, these documents, this UN declaration, the act and the action plan, essentially they are just words on paper unless they mean something and have an impact on Indigenous peoples, on individuals in communities. And so, you know, it's fine for us to be, you know, in government kind of sitting around and reading these and thinking about the words. And but if they're not reaching Indigenous peoples, then, you know, they don't have the meaning or the influence or the impact that we might want them to have. And so having them available in Indigenous languages is very important, and is something that we're turning our minds to as well. And I think that, you know, that thank you for bringing that up, because that is something that we see as important as well. It has to be out there, and it has to be accessible, and it has to be available. And then, you know, I think the sort of that big discussion there, that very sort of crunchy question of, you know, the Indigenous ways of understanding laws and justice and versus the Western system, and how those sort of, you know, conflict with or can jive with each other, is a really important, a very important issue as well, that, you know, I don't know that we can address just in this format here, but is true. You know, the work that we do is at the Department of Justice is founded in a Western colonial system, and is limited by that. And the work that we put out is influenced and shaped by that as well. And so, you know, we can't escape that shapes the work that we do. It, you know, has necessarily will have shaped the action plan, and you know, through those commitments in the action plan, and through, you know, some of the action plan measures around the revitalization of Indigenous legal systems and legal orders and understandings of justice, that, you know, perhaps incrementally, but you know, certainly, you know, tangibly, will help shift the needle and kind of move that, and, you know, help us come to an understanding, you know, of justice systems that isn't just based in that Western understanding. But I really do appreciate the points that you've brought up, and I'm very grateful for, if I heard correctly, that might have been the last question. But if that is the case, I'm very grateful for what everyone has shared, and for all the words, and you know, for people sort of speaking up and bringing your voices to this discussion. It's very valuable and very important for us to hear that.
Is there a mechanism to ensure that that $38 million that was committed to the development of action plans resilient so that if there is a change of government, that will not change? Yes?
That's a great question. There's a 4 million sort of ongoing commitment to the action plan, or to the implementation. The action plan, the UN Declaration Act, is now a law, right? And so while future governments may be able to, try to bring change, like it's a very difficult thing to do, to sort of undo this law now that it is in place. And so future governments will be obligated to continue implementing the act and to continue reporting on progress and to continue ensuring that the laws of Canada are consistent with the declaration, and because this is now a law. And I completely understand your concern around a change in government and ongoing commitments, and which is why this legislative route was was implemented, to kind of put an act in place that could withstand changes in government. As far as the future sort of financial commitments and budget commitments, that's a little bit more challenging for me to speak to, but I take your concern for sure.
Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you all.